So before we start, I do want to say sorry that I haven't uploaded a video in a while. It's been kind of difficult because, like I said in my last video, I started a new job, which is a really cool job. I really like it. It's just hard because normally I would do my video recordings during the week, during the day. So right now, my next step is I need to get a set of lights that I can use to actually shoot my videos at any time of the day or at night, so I can actually make videos again. But with that being said, I hope everybody did have a great Christmas. I know I did. I can kind of show you some of the things that I got. I actually got this from my girlfriend. I'll probably end up showing this in a later video. This is a Polaroid camera. Look, this is like one of the new ones that they just introduced. I swear I didn't get it for myself. I got it from my girlfriend. She said she wanted one. But I do think it'd be kind of cool to make a video on this in the future, just kind of going over some of the features or lack thereof of this camera, and also just kind of show you guys some of the pictures it takes, because I think Polaroids are pretty cool. I've never really owned a Polaroid camera. I've only taken a handful of Polaroid shots ever, so I think it's kind of cool. And then my girlfriend got me a pair of headphones, which is very useful because I left my headphones out in San Antonio at my friend Chris's house. And actually, I think that he's making a video of us soon, so I'll probably let you guys know when that's up. But this is by a company called Symphonize, and they're kind of cool. I don't know if you can see it, but it's like all wood grain headphones. I don't know how much wood is in it, but I think it looks pretty cool and they sound fantastic. And then this is actually a birthday present, but I just got it in. It's a watch. It's kind of cool. It's like an old vintage watch from like the 80s. And my dad got it repaired from some guy in Australia. So that's kind of something that I really liked. Okay, so to get in the video, because I think I've rambled enough, today we're going to be talking about getting not necessarily the perfect exposure, but just getting the right camera settings, because I know it's something that maybe it's a little bit, not an exact science for some people, but for me, it's just like a little cookie cutter thing that I do every single time that I'm going out and taking photos, and it's something it's made it easy for me to remember all of the steps for taking my photos. Okay, so the first thing that we're gonna be dealing with is just getting the right composition, because if you don't have a good composition, you don't really have anything at all. So you're gonna be focusing on that first and foremost. So don't worry about the exposure, all that stuff when you're starting out. You basically want to just figure out where you want to point your camera, and one thing that can really help you with that is getting a tripod. If you don't already have a tripod, go out there and get one. They can be pretty cheap if you want a cheapy one, or maybe you know somebody who has a spare tripod laying around. I would highly recommend it. I think that it's one of those things that will allow you to take your time and really focus on some of the important parts of photography, and not necessarily having to worry about getting everything right immediately. I think it's gonna be key for you. So that's the first thing, just getting the composition right. So the second thing is getting your exposure right. Now, this isn't gonna be very obvious for a lot of people because it's not really the way a lot of people are kind of taught to expose for images, and it's not a way that your camera would expose for images. So if you're doing like auto exposure, your camera's not gonna be doing what you need it to do. So I would highly recommend shooting a manual for this, because you just won't be able to do it otherwise. And I think that this technique is called expose to the right, or ETTR. And what that is basically saying is on the histogram, the right side of the image is the highlights, the left side is the shadows. So if you're exposing to the right, that means that you're exposing for those highlights. So what I like to do is make sure that there are no clipping highlights in the image. And the reason why this is important is if you have clipping highlights and you want to try to, in post, like in Lightroom or Photoshop or something, if you want to try to bring your image down in those highlights, you could lose all that information. It kind of has like a gross gray look to it. And I can show you an example right here of how these images can be affected by this bad exposure. So here we have an example of an image that I took out in Bishop. Now, this looks like it'd be very dark. And if you look over here on the histogram, you'll see it is a very dark image. And if I turn on the highlight clipping warning and the shadow clipping warning, you see that there are some clipped shadows, but there aren't any clipped highlights. So this, in my opinion, would be a correctly exposed image, believe it or not, versus this one where you can very, very clearly see the entire inside of this cabin, but maybe not so much the outside, and you can see that there's clipping highlights on the outside. Now, I do want to show you what happens if you were to try to kind of get the information back from some of these highlights. So I'm just going to bring the exposure down. It's kind of the cheapy, easy way. And if you can see what's happening here, look at that. It's like a gross gray. And that's not because the clouds are gray. That is actually missing information in the image. So it doesn't matter what technique I use there, these areas are gonna have no information available for you to kind of pull back. And I can kind of show you that contrasting with this image. So this is the correctly exposed image, and as you can see, there's very clearly still information left there. And if I bring the exposure down just a tiny bit, you'll see you have a lot of beautiful cloud detail along with some nice speckles of dust on my sensor, which I have since gotten cleaned. But you see the difference, and I can zoom in on both of these images. Look at that. That looks disgusting. There's no information there. And in this image, there is information. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, but now your image looks terrible still. Not quite, because the thing about exposing to the right is, yeah, you're able to get the highlights there, but are you able to get the shadows? And the answer is yes. Your camera can recover far more in the shadow details than it can in the highlight details. Once it's clipped in the highlights, there's nothing left. But if you're clipped in the shadows, you can still pull that information back to be viewable, and in many cases, good information. And that's why it's kind of important, if you're doing this, to have, I guess, like a better camera, one that has better like low light performance, maybe better dynamic range. This is where those specs for a camera will really shine, is exposing for images like this. Now I can show you what this is gonna do, and this is just a really cheap little edit right here. This isn't how I would normally edit it, but I can bring the highlights down, I can bring the shadows all the way up, pump it up, and then maybe I'll even bring the exposure up a little bit more. So I have the highlight clipping warning right here, and nothing's clipping yet. And I think that looks fairly decent. I'm gonna see if I can bring the highlights to clip over here, and that's fine if you have like a little bit. And there we go. So you have that versus whatever you're able to do with this, which is basically nothing. This image is basically a throwaway trash image. You can't do anything with it because it has clipped highlights. And see if I can kind of show you a little bit of difference here. So you have that versus this, and look at those clouds. That looks gross. So that's really what we're focusing on here, is exposing to the right, because that's the best way to get the full tonal range in your images without getting clipping in the highlights or just crappy shadows. And that was, you saw right there, a quick little cheapy edit, just bringing down the highlights, bringing up the shadows, maybe messing around with the exposure a little bit, and you can go on from there. You can do your vibrance, saturation, clarity, whatever you like on top of those edits to get the desired effect that you would like. Now, how do you get to that point? How do you actually get the exposure correct, and what do you do for the camera settings? Now, that for me is something very, very easy, because I like to do landscape photography, so 90% of the images that I shoot are gonna be basically the same. Now, I'll start with ISO because that's the easiest. ISO, if you don't already know, is just a measurement of your camera's sensor, its sensitivity to light. So if you have ISO 100, that's not very sensitive. And then if you have ISO 6400, that is very sensitive to light. And while they both have their benefits and drawbacks, ISO 100 is gonna kind of yield the better image qualities overall, because at ISO 6400, you have those grainy looking images, which may or may not be bad for you. I don't really know what you're shooting, but the ISO 6400 allows for faster shutter speeds or maybe longer depths of field because it's more sensitive to light, so you have to kind of counteract those sensitivities with different settings. So I like to do ISO 100 because I want my images to be tack sharp. I want them to be the best image quality possible, which is also reflected with the next setting that I usually try to set, and that's my aperture. So if you don't already know, almost every single lens has like a range for its aperture that is the most sharp. Now, this is either going to be found like on a website like DxOMark, where they rate lenses and sharpnesses and stuff like that, or you can just kind of experiment, mess around with your camera a little bit, check out the different settings. But usually I would say that f5.6 to f11 is going to be the best range for the sharpest images for most lenses. I like to use f8, which is just, I don't know, the aperture setting that I've usually stuck it on. Now, of course, this does change from time to time based on my image. Like if I have a wide angle image and it's up close to something and I really want to get like a long depth of field, maybe I'll set my camera to f22. It's really not a big deal. I just like to set it to f8 like most of the time. So once you have the ISO setting, the aperture, then you can set the shutter speed. And obviously if you're setting the ISO, the aperture, and then you're waiting for the shutter speed, there's basically only going to be a few different shutter speeds that it could be, and that's just gonna require you to kind of mess around a little bit, figuring out based on the exposed to the right technique, what you need to set the shutter speed at. So with this photo that I just showed you, for example, oh, look at that, it was actually at f22. So that's actually a very odd setting for me. I normally wouldn't set it like that, but this was a great example of a time that I would use f22 because I think I focused on the wood here in the front, and I also wanted the mountains in the back to be as sharp as possible. So I think that's why I set it like that. But I can kind of go through the steps of how I decided to expose for this, and I can reset all the settings here. So obviously, first thing I did was set my camera on a tripod, and then I set my ISO to 100 to get the best image quality that I could. And then I thought, what do I want the focus of my image to be, and what do I want the importance to be on? And that is obviously getting the whole image in focus and as sharp as possible. So what I did was I focused on the wood here in the front, and I thought I need to make sure that the mountains are perfect. So I set the camera, or I set the lens to the smallest aperture that's possible on that lens, which is the Canon 24-70. I set it to f22 to be able to get the full focus range, or at least the best that I could. And so I set it to f22. And then I played around with my shutter speed settings to get the exposure perfect on the highlights up here and the highlights up here to ensure that there wasn't any clipping. So obviously 1/8 of a second was what I needed to set the shutter speed to. So that was an effective means of getting this nice image with the full tonal range in there. And this is something that I use seriously every single time I take photos. Doesn't matter if it's portraits, it doesn't matter if it's sports photos. It's every single time I go out and take photos. And I can show you kind of a cool example right here. Scripps Pier is one of my all-time favorite places to go take photographs. And this isn't a completed image. I haven't really showed this to anybody yet, but this was another great example of what I did. So you see right here, the highlights, there's basically no clipping highlights. Maybe there's a little bit down here, but that's not the end of the world. That's such a tiny piece of the image. And then all I have to do is just drag the highlights down a little bit, drag the shadows up, and then look at that. You have all the beautiful detail here under the pier. And then maybe I can even bring the exposure up a tiny, tiny bit and the highlights down, and then you can just have a field day with the saturation and vibrance. And you see you have all the beautiful detail here in the clouds, you have all the beautiful detail under the pier, and for the most part, it looks pretty good. I mean, obviously there's a little bit of chromatic aberration, which is very fixable, but you have a very nice image, and it wasn't very difficult to do. It didn't really require a lot of additional thinking from me. But the really nice thing about having a system to expose like this is it really takes the guesswork out of every single image. You know that every image you take is gonna be basically the same. It's gonna be following the same format, the same exposure. You won't really have to worry about not getting that exposure perfect every single time. So if there's one thing to take away from this, it's just make sure that you don't clip the highlights and to just figure out what your basic camera settings are gonna be and then work from there. So I think that just about wraps it up. Before I do end the video though, I do wanna say I'm trying my hardest to try to get a video out every single week. It's just very, very difficult with my job and then also just the holidays right now, as everybody can kind of relate to. But I will be getting some lights pretty soon. I have an idea of which kind of lights I want, but I will be getting those. And maybe you'll see it in a future video. Maybe I'll talk about the lights, but it's something I'm looking forward to so I can actually keep on this one video per week schedule and not miss any more videos for you guys. So I do want to thank you if you ended up making it to the end of the video, because I will be seeing you in a future video. I'm gonna say next week. I'm gonna try my hardest to make it there, but I will see you in the next video, and please enjoy your new year.